Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Urban Fae, Banshee in the City, Part 2. There I was at Mr. Gosling's memorial service, pondering the ways of the other world, from which entities had apparently marked me for death. The ceremony wasn't really a funeral. There wasn't much left to cremate. I listened to his friends and family recount the events of his extraordinary life. He'd been a genuine hero and had come home from foreign wars with a healing heart. He'd spent his entire life serving others, pretty much the opposite of how I'd spent the last 6 years or so. Another inspiration for me to stay on the straight and narrow path. After a while, the tearful farewells began to blend, and I sunk once more into my dark thoughts, until I heard my name, spoken by a sweet, young, feminine voice. "Robert McIntyre?" I looked up startled with a, "Duh, who's me, what?" expression. She looked at me expectantly, and her body language clearly indicated that I should rise and approach the podium. I climbed up behind the lectern with the microphone. A slideshow played on a large screen behind me that depicted moments of Mr. Gosling's life. It had stopped on the one with him and me and my buddies. I had no idea what to say, so I just spoke the words as they came. "We've heard so many tales today about Mr. G. That's what I called him. He called me Champ. My time with him was brief and ended in a personal tragedy, not unlike the one he suffered. He stayed beside me. I never thought about him having a family, a life of his own. I was a child, self-absorbed and suffering the agony of ultimate grief. Yet he set aside his own priorities to stay by my side, to reassure me and to ensure I was safe until my family claimed me. Yet it was the times before that I remember best. The fun we had, the stories he would tell to help us, the other kids and me, learn about life, the easy way as he called it. He lent me books and did his best to set an example of how a boy should grow to be a man. I'll always be grateful to Mr. G. The celebration of life event at their home after the memorial service brought me another step closer to having decent feelings for others, a step closer to empathy. Yet I remained true to my nature and stood alone in a corner, munching on whatever snack food had been on the table for guests. The house was far nicer than I could have imagined. It was on the lake, where everything was pricey. Thank you for speaking today, Robbie. I know we surprised you, but Dad always said that if we found you, you would be part of our family. One of our flock of wild geese. It was the voice, that young woman, Sorsha, Mr. G's youngest daughter. I really appreciate what you said. You clearly knew Dad pretty well. I didn't know what to say, but I met her eyes, deep emerald gems, under bright red curls that seemed to stray in whatever direction they pleased. I realized she was waiting for a reply. "Oh, well, Mr. G was my friend, and our lives intersected just before that defining moment in my own. He made a real impression. I should have taken more of his advice. I suppose I did, just not in the way he intended. I wish I'd been in a better frame of mind after the incident. Maybe I could have stayed in touch with him. I've had some tough experiences, but I think I came out stronger than I would have otherwise. Between my folks and Mr. G, some of my fosters were pretty good too, especially the Hearns." Mrs. Gosling approached from behind her daughter. "Sorsha, I'm going to give Rob here the items that your dad wanted him to have. Would you like to come along in case I forget anything?" I soon found myself in an upstairs library and office combination. No wonder the man always had a book to lend. I thought as I quickly surveyed the shelves, piled floor to ceiling with tomes of every description, all organized into sections by subject and alphabetized by author. This is impressive, ma'am. Mr. G was always generous about lending me books. I had no idea of his resources. The newly made widow smiled, wistfully, that word again. The night Mrs. Hearn contacted him, Sean set out some books and other items for you. He was excited and hopeful that we would get to see you soon. I didn't know until later that the two of you had chatted. Her eyes went distant for a moment. She was clearly back in that moment, again facing the trauma of losing the love of her life to some as yet unexplained terror. The police had titled it Wild Dogs, but everyone, including the police, knew better. I thought for a moment that Sorsha would take up the threads of the conversation, but Ms. Ellie snapped out of her flashback and shook her head. I'm sorry, it hasn't been easy. Yet Sean would want you to have these items. He talked about them a little. She walked over to a small table. There were several around the room, each with interesting artifacts and whatnots, or on or under the surfaces. This one held a plain-looking case. She opened the case and stepped to one side so that I'd have room to peruse the contents while we stood together. She picked up each in turn and handed it to me, like it was some sort of ceremony. First was a large and colorful illustrated book, Ancient Ways, A Guide to the Otherworld. She read the title as she handed it to me. He said that it would get you started. I don't know what he meant, but that's what he said about it. He loved his myths and legends. There were a few more books, each more esoteric than the last. Then she reached the other items. First was a weird-looking belt. It was made out of some kind of cured hide with grainy fur. It had a metal buckle with a figure picked out in small blue stones. A wolf? Maybe a coyote. It was featured as sitting, nose turned up towards the moon. That had once been a 1916 Mercury dime. I couldn't think of it as exactly stylish, but it was cool. She frowned a little at the next offering. He said that this was a little claw for you and that you would know how to use it. It was indeed a small knife, the blade only between 3 and 4 inches. It was slightly curved and had a hump of metal along the back of the blade that would prevent a wet thumb or edge of a hand from sliding onto the sharp edge of the other side, or a place for a thumb to press the blade into, whatever one needed to cut. It was plain and looked like it had belonged to some sort of specialized tradesman. It was well worn, and the steel carried a dark patina. A claw indeed, from a well-worn paw. There were only a few items left inside the case. One had been set in diagonally and still barely fit. It was a large knife, more like a short sword. It was in a scabbard made of shiny leather-looking material. Miss Ellie assumed a fearful look, but quickly replaced it with a solemn one. She locked eyes with me. This is one he said you may have to learn to use, perhaps along with the claw. It is special, and he said that it belonged to your father. He wanted to give it to you after the explosion, but feared that your aunt and uncle would take it from you. That might be why he kept all of these things. I took the exquisite piece in my hands. My gaze shifted from her eyes to the sheathed weapon. The sheath was plain enough, a charcoal gray affair. Maybe shark skin over some type of wood. The handle was breathtaking. Dark horn or bone, with a snarled lupine head, picked out in green stones and traced with silver. The snout faced down towards the blade with deadly intent. The pommel was a knob of silver with the face of the moon worked out in dark pits in the metal. I turned over the piece and saw that the pattern continued, as with the actual earthly satellite. On the other side of the handle was another lupine figure. This one appeared to be howling, eyes closed and the hint of a smile on its ferocious jowls. Its snout faced the moon-inspired pommel. The stone's a real Connemara from Erin, and the silver is all real, put together by a master smith from Norway, Mrs. Gosling assured me. For some reason, my normal arrogance was disconnected. I grasped the handle and then looked at her for permission. She nodded, and I slowly drew the blade. It was an elongated drop point, almost a leaf shape, narrow but substantial all at once. Inside the steel were patterns, straight linear marks that were part of how the blade was worked, yet seemed organized like writing. There were some swirls picked out in bronze and silver. They almost picked out a scene, different on each side of the blade, just hints of activities, a mystery to be studied for countless hours. It was hard to set down the blade beside the other treasures, but I managed to shift my focus back to the last few items in the case. There was a fishhook with some line attached. Weird, but it belonged to my dad, so cool. Then what appeared to be a miniature belt with a clear crystal set opposite the buckle. I realized that it was a headband, a diadem. The leather was tooled and very nice, but had Mrs. Gosling not informed me that it belonged to my mother, I would have never looked at it twice. The last item was not what Mrs. Ellie described as a torque. I'd read about them, but had never seen one in person. This one was heavy, gold weave with finials at the end in the form of a long-snouted, slender wolf head, one snarling and one smiling. That had belonged to my grandfather, according to the notes Mr. Gosling had left for his wife, though it didn't indicate whether paternal or maternal. Oh, and you may have the case as well, Sean. Mr. G, she smiled, said to remind you that no matter where you go, no matter what restrictions or rules are in place, you must always keep the big knife with you, and that the case will help. And the rest is up to you. I think that some of those items are rare and valuable. I hope that you will keep them. It would be a shame. Well, they're yours now. Your decision to make. Now I have guests to attend to. Perhaps you and Sorsha can visit for a while. She glanced at the narrow windows. Oh my, time slips away. It's gotten dark on us. And with that, she slipped quietly from the room. I placed the treasures carefully into the case and left a big blade in its plain scabbard on top. I kept out the claw knife and attached its little sheath to my belt. It should be legal, even in the city. Sorsha stood over by one of the windows, the one with the computer desk on it, and stared out into the darkness beyond the reflective glass. He was sitting just here when you were chatting that night, she spoke, quietly, but I could hear her clearly in the quiet room with only the two of us. I walked over to stand beside her. The view was unimpressive, a reflection, the two of us standing there staring like idiots, and a dark emptiness beyond. It was suddenly made clear when an exterior light activated. I could see a large tree outside the window. The branches were mostly denuded of leaves, with winter quickly approaching. The branches swayed in the wind that gently blew over and around the house. Then one set of them started to shake violently. Something was in that tree. A bulky shadow form crept out from a limb and approached the window. Its hair stood on end and its green eyes lit with a baleful inner light, glaring through the glass at the two mortals who dared to face it. The wind outside picked up for a moment and howled. Was it truly the wind, or was it that other haunting voice? I started to ask Sorsha if she'd heard it, but to my horror, she was lifting the window and speaking softly and encouragingly to the creature that approached us. Its inky dark face now gaped open to reveal fangs and a red tongue as it uttered a low, guttural groan. Meow. Stupid cat, I shouted in my mind. The thing was huge, and the limb could scarcely support its weight. Yet it was an otherwise normal feline. It sprang from the tree into the windowsill and then into the waiting and welcoming arms of Sorsha. She was a large enough girl, but the thing knocked her back a few steps from its sheer mass. It was the size of a large lynx. Sorsha laughed. "Tim Tildrum, you scared the color from our guest's face." "Naughty king of the cats," she said the last in mocking scorn tone, and then laughed again. For some reason, I didn't have my normal annoyed or even angry reaction. I found myself smiling at the lovely creature holding the big sinister one. In the clear indoor lighting, I could see that Tim was black, but with a white spot on his chest, a blob shaped almost like a crown. Sorsha followed my eyes and raised up a cooperative furball for proper inspection. "We named him Tim Tildrum after the first king of the cats in the old story. He came to us as a stray, and when Dad saw that crown-shaped white patch, well, we just had to adopt him. Don't get the wrong idea, though. He's nobody's pet, but a free and independent actor all his own." With that, the big feline wriggled free and plopped to the floor. He made a few rounds through the library, all the while casing suspicious sidelong glances in my direction, and then sprang once more to the windowsill and then out into the darkness. Not long after, we said our goodbyes, exchanged contact information, and headed home with the Hermes. As we walked to our car, I heard the beginning of the keening sound. From out near the lake, it was cut short by the screeching yowls of a large cat, and then sputters and hisses, then silence. After a moment, the normal sounds of insects and frogs, each hunting for meals or mates, replaced the odd noises that had intruded from dark places out among the trees. The Hearns did not seem to notice. We were all full of good food and deep thoughts. Maybe they would be able to rest after the long day. But I feared my sleep would be riddled with nightmares and haunted by mournful howls and tangled, sweat-soaked sheets. I was right. Eventually, nightmares faded, and the dawn shines brightly through windows and onto sleeping brows. A nice way of saying that I slept in the next day until the sunlight streamed through the window, struck my eyes, and forced them open. The Hearns were in a decent frame of mind, but I was not. I did my best to hide it, but Mr. Hearn saw right through my subterfuge. "Rob, I know you experienced something otherworldly last night. Sometimes we mortals, no matter how well connected we are, just can't. Which is why Molly and I didn't react when you did. So have you looked over your inheritance?" I thought for a moment. I am not a mere mortal, too? Then shrugged off the speculation as anything other than his making a clumsy attempt at conversation to help me feel better. Nonsense, I put him back in the case. Seems odd that Mr. G would have things that my parents owned. I thought everything was taken in the fire. I didn't think to ask Mrs. Gosling. There wasn't anything too crazy last night. Just a big black tomcat and that keening whale. I'll be fine. I just need some exercise. Think I'll go see if anyone found my bike. He pursed his lips. Maybe you should stay away from that neighborhood, at least until you've taken stock of your new resources. He sounded pretty sincere, and as insistent as he could be without using a tone that he knew would cause me to dig in my heels in resistance. I'll look first, I recalled Mrs. Gosling's admonition on behalf of her late husband that I keep the big blade on me. I was wearing the little sheath with the claw knife. It fit well into my left palm in a blade-down style, and the hump on the lower part of the blade acted in lieu of a crossguard. It made the blade very utilitarian and dangerous all at once. Naturally, I loved it. I opened the case and took out the longer weapon. It wouldn't be much use as anything else. I hated the thought of carrying it around and getting confiscated by the popo or damaged in my travels. Yet, what else could I do? It was a better option for trouble than anything else I could get in the market available to me. Besides, I liked practical, useful items. I had no time for decorative whatnots, as Miss Molly called them. I rigged the scabbard onto my belt, but hanging down inside my pant leg. With my shirt pulled over the hilt, it was pretty well concealed. The tip reached just above my knee, so I tried sitting. It poked out a little, but I tended to wear my breeches loose, so it would do. I sat for a moment and picked up the book that had been on top of the others, the only one Mrs. Gosling had called by name, Ancient Ways, A Guide to the Other World. The cover was beautifully illustrated with images of a green forest and ancient stone structures set out in a pattern. I opened it, and inside the cover there was a handwritten message. Hey, champ. I hope that you received this under happy circumstances. I'll find you sooner or later, or you'll find me. However, in case things go wrong, I wanted you to have this book and some others. They aren't really training manuals, but they may help you understand some of the wider worlds to which you will be introduced in your lifetime. I made notes on important pages. I hope that they are helpful. My family and yours have been connected for a long time. Toward the end, your parents gave me some of their most treasured items to keep on your behalf. If anything happens to me, my wife, Ellie, will ensure that you get them with at least some explanation. You come from a special people, Rob. I hope that you have started to discover how things work for you. It will help you to understand what I mean. That said, you must take the journey of discovery. It's not for me to tell you everything. Just offer some guideposts to point you to more information. All the best to you, Coyote. Sean Gosling, Mr. G. P.S. Coyote is what your folks called you. The last name they used is related to the Irish Gaelic word for wolf, but you are not yet big enough to be a wolf. How could I have forgotten about my folks calling me Coyote? When I first gave that name to my hood rat associates, it had been a joke, one that only the older ones understood. Coyote, Wile E. Coyote, I'd pronounced it. It was from the old Warner Brothers cartoons my dad had loved so much. The laugh it incurred had saved me from a beating or worse, and allowed time for my silver tongue to work its magic on their slow, benighted minds. My memory was a strange affair. I could recall ridiculous details about stupid conversations, yet hadn't even thought about the fun source of my nickname from moments with my folks. I just didn't think about them unless I had to. Too painful. Made me feel wistful. Maybe I would have to work through all that. I flipped through the pages and saw that many had handwritten notes in the empty spaces. One proclaimed, "Do not take food or drink in the other world unless you intend to stay, and never remove any items to the mortal realm, Mundania, some call it. It allows them to track you." I closed the tome and pursued the others. Some pages had writing, most did not. I had no idea what to do with the fish hook or headband. The belt was pretty ugly, so I put it around my waist, but inside my pants, under my usual belt, then pulled my pants over it. I studied the torque for a long time. It was beautiful and heavy. I didn't think it would be a normal for everyday wear, so I put it and the headband back in the case. Maybe the headband could be used as a hatband, I considered. Once I'd closed the case, I put it in my hidey hole behind the dresser. I'd installed it for loot and contraband, but it would work well for hiding my personal treasures. I kept out the fishhook and line and ended up sticking them in the watch pocket of my jeans. I was getting stir-crazy. I held no real hope for finding my bike. It was a nice one, and I'd left it on the verges of the hood. Yet looking for it gave me a purpose, however forlorn, and I set out for the Badlands on foot. Probably dumb, maybe even suicidal, my logical mind offered, to no avail. It was windy outdoors with just a hint of ice. Winter solstice would arrive soon. Mr. Hearn had been on the phone when I left. He had to consult with his younger son Bart to determine who would be the object of the next wild hunt. He was the Hearn, but he had to train up his successor. I did not envy him or his family that task, and I downright pitied the poor soul who was picked. At least it won't be me. I internally sighed in relief. I'd met Bart and the other two Hearnlings. Nice enough people, a little clannish and secretive, but hey, they had genuine secrets to hide. Bart was the youngest, but for a few years older than me, and it was his leaving the nest that had led the Hearns to enrolling in the foster parent program. Or so they'd told the social services folk. I really had to make some life decisions soon. I still had some funds, but I'd learned that when no more money is added, they very noticeably depleted with rapidity. I still wasn't ready to commit to any career path, especially a military one with so little pay in it. Maybe I could hawk some of my inherited items. My imprudent thoughts were interrupted when a man on a too-small bicycle approached me and came to a dead stop directly in my path. "Sup, dude? You lost?" He was young-looking, as best I could tell with the hoodie and shades. I glanced around to regain my bearings. "Where's Elle?" The man stared at me for a moment, his eyes inscrutable behind the dark glasses. "You ain't heard?" I felt a sense of gloom descend over me. I'd been given enough death notices in my short life to know that my buddy was gone. What happened to him? He was a friend. He gave me an even longer silent stare, then shrugged. "Crossfire. Place has been a war zone since Jaguar's crew fell apart. Skittle ain't liking it that things spilled into his block." I nodded. Yeah, Skittles always did right by me when I carried for him. Amazing how much information one can cram into a short sentence like that. I at once told him that I was a known entity to his boss, that I was on good terms with that boss, as far as I knew, and that I was shady at least so I wouldn't bring down any official scrutiny, and that I was an unaffiliated contractor. Elle's family, okay? He nodded and apparently decided I'd passed whatever test his devious mind had devised. Skittle had a small crew, but he had a rare talent for picking smart members. We take care of our own. "Cool," I replied. "Think I can pass through to Sonny's block? I've been out for a while. I don't know the score." Elle usually kept me straight. I hoped that he'd assumed I'd been in jail or prison, and that he might even take pity on me and tell me something useful. He eyed me once again skeptical. "You on foot?" I shrugged. "Bike is gone. Part of my business and why I'm here early in the evening before the pawn shops close." I knew all of the pawn shop owners, especially the dirtiest dealers. They'd been some of my fences for liberated odds and ends. Eventually I got a chin flick as a positive response. Alas, no más información. I internally groused as he rode away, back to his intersection. I walked on and watched as he used his cell phone to check my story and to let others know that I was in the area. I'm sure he snapped some photos to forward, but I didn't try to hide. It would only make things worse. It was likely that he suspected my identity, but odd that he hadn't asked. Then again, he hadn't provided a handle either, so the hood standards of courtesy were still intact. I checked a few shops with no real hope. The ones I usually dealt with would have changed the appearance of the bike and sold it out of the back door. Then I set out for Sonny's dumbass club. Bay View. Eye roll. He would be there this early, but maybe Mercedes would be in the house getting the girls ready. When I first heard her name, I was inclined to think of her as Mercedes, no class, in a play on the various classes used by the manufacturer. But her sharp mind and bootylicious, well, she'd quickly risen in my esteem. The keening howl split my nerves. It came from a storm drain down the block to my left. Maybe. I shivered at the chill that raced up my spine. I hated that sound. It was early, but already well after dark when I neared the nudie club. From a good distance, I could see red and blue flashing and whirling lights. Without getting closer than necessary, I found a place from which to observe events unfold. An EMS truck pulled away from the scene and the driver shut down the flashing lights. There was no siren. Either there had been no actual medical emergency, they had resolved the emergency without transporting the victim, or the victim was dead. Based on the number of police units, I guessed the latter. My concerns were confirmed when a hearse from the medical examiner's office arrived. I was getting cold standing in one place. Not the chill that had accompanied the wild hunt, but cold enough to be uncomfortable. Yet the scene ended fairly abruptly as all but one of the police units left, and the last turned off the red and blue flashers. Shortly, that one left, clearly escorting the vehicle from the ME's office. I'd seen nothing but a sheet-wrapped body loaded into that long, black modified sedan. Another grave-crossing chill enveloped me. Once the officers left, I saw that Sony, Papa Boo Boo, and Biggie S stood at the entrance to the nightclub. They wore mournful expressions and appeared shocked and dismayed, maybe even wistful. Another internal eye roll. My heart skipped a beat for a moment. I dared hope that it was Sony wrapped in that sheet. Apparently he was too dumb to die. Maybe just too trashy. And yes, though I hate to admit it, he was a tough SOB. I approached slowly. I didn't want to startle them. Hey, Sony. What's up? You all right? The three large men turned towards me with slack expressions that turned briefly hostile and suspicious, and then relaxed into cold neutrality. Coyote, Sony pronounced. Been a while. Where you been at? I shrugged. You know how it is. Things got hot with Jaguar and his crew. Had to let everything cool down. I chose to avoid the lie about being in jail. Sony could easily have verified the truth, and we'd had a serious credibility problem. With the scout I'd encountered earlier, I had simply implied and he'd inferred. Or not. Hard to tell with that dude. Moan in, man, he gestured and turned. Biggie S held the door open for the rest of us. Papa Boo Boo led the way to Sony's garishly decorated, funky-smelling office. It looked like a hood rat's dream of a seraglio. Once he was seated on his sultan's throne, a leather office chair with the two large wings on the back, he eyed me over his glasses. Glad you're here, man. Had something freaky go down tonight. Funny you showed up when you did. He left his last statement hanging in the air, a challenge and an unasked question. I decided to stick with the truth. I was getting pretty warped after associating with so many decent people of late. I was looking for my bike. It went missing. Don't have much hope. I was thinking of upgrading to something with an engine anyway. Saw the popo outside. Watched the rest from down the block. One of your crew? Anybody I know? I had answered his question that I wasn't involved and let him know that I was still a turd like him and that I had ambitions that I did not want to wreck. Amazing how much subcontext goes into a few words, as long as everybody involved in the conversation is speaking in the same terms. He sat quietly for a moment, digesting what I'd said, then abruptly stood. I feared that things were about to get physical, but he walked around the desk towards the door and again beckoned me to follow. He led me through the dancers' locker room and to the back entrance of the building. There was police tape all around and over the door. Sony ignored it and opened the door. "See what you think," he said in a low, forsaken tone. What I thought was that the scene was right out of some horror slasher flick. There was blood everywhere and the telltale signs that there had been other scrapes and bits of body, marked with police tabs and cones now removed. I stared from the threshold and looked both ways up and down the alley. From one end, the end that led deeper into Sony's territory, there were marks in the gravel surface, and the blades of grass along the back wall of the clubhouse were crushed. It looked like a giant serpent had crawled up to the back door of the club and attacked someone before she entered for work. I looked at Sony, my heart sinking. Who was it? I shook my head in denial. Mercedes ripped to pieces? Much like poor Mr. Gosling. The tracks looked like my old friend from the sewer had made them. The serpent chick, yet it was a long slither to the lake and Mr. G's place, unless there was a shortcut through the other world. There had to be more than one creature or being slaughtering people. I couldn't imagine why the Grim Reaper would pick Lamongello and Mercedes. They had no connection, and of course their deaths had been from very different causes. Then Sony's reptilian cool voice intruded on my musings. "Yeah, Skittle lost one of his crew the other day. We was thinking that maybe the war over in Jaguar's Block might be interfering with our business." His accent had thickened with grief and intoxication. He slammed down 3 glasses of Courvoisier during our visit, and the cognac had him reeling. You mean L? The lookout for Skittle. I knew him. I always had to check in with him when I carried for Skittle and Company, I reminded Sony. I only met Mercedes the one time. I think you had hired her while I was out recovering, or maybe she was still a dancer? Sony stared at his desk. It had several of the executive toys that had been favored for management desks a few decades past. He reached out and spun the blades of a helicopter made of steel wires. "Yeah, she was a dancer. Head dancer, and I let her start running the bar. Business never made more money, so I let her start helping with the other books. I saw that you liked her." He raised his head and pushed up his glasses. "She didn't like many, and she made sure to talk you up. She was one of the few women that wouldn't pay me no attention. I liked that. If she didn't want me, then I know she wouldn't get stupid on account of another man." "Yeah, right, butt wipe," I thought in pure contempt. How could anyone resist your crusty? No, stay constructive. We want revenge if we can get it. I lost another friend a couple of weeks ago. We just buried him yesterday. Good man. I called him Mr. G. He took care of me when my folks died. It seemed like I'm losing a lot of friends lately. Sony looked up, and after a few moments of deep concentration, his eyes narrowed into a glare. "You got something going on, Wile E. Coyote? You somehow took out some of Jaguar's toughest crew, then disappeared. Then came back and took out the man himself and the rest of his killers. Now you back and people dying all around? The accent had returned, and specks of spittle now flicked from his lips. A sure sign that he was getting close to genuine drunken fury. His already slow wit had been further dimmed by alcoholic beverages, and I knew that once he got an idea in his head, it was almost impossible to shake it loose. Sony, Jaguar, and his crew tried to kill me. I had every reason to take care of that business. I liked Mercedes, and I liked Elle. Good people who were good to me. I want to get this straight as much as you do. I saw that my logic was not penetrating quickly enough. Sony, why would I risk that with you? Why would I disrespect you like that? He glowered in concentration, as though he was mad at having to think. He probably was. It likely made his head hurt. I think you had help, Coyote. Some secret crew that took out Jaguar and his peeps. Maybe some kind of pros. Maybe ex-military or that Central American gang that does mercenary work for dealers. You smart and you can handle yourself, but you ain't hardcore. I don't know for sure, but I got eyes on you. Best you stay in line. I stared at him for a moment and then rose. He stayed seated, and I saw that he had not shaved his head as recently as he usually did. His head stubble was all gray. He was even more truly old school than I'd realized, by virtue of being old. I still have no reason to hurt my friends. I've always thought of you as a friend, as much as we can be when it's just business. I walked out with Sony and his two favorite goons eyeing me suspiciously. I left unanswered his implied question of whether I had developed my own crew. If he thought I'd turned into an enforcer or an outright assassin, maybe it would give him pause before he messed with me. Coyote. Ninja Coyote. I smirked to myself. I caught the bus back towards the land of the living. My bike was a lost cause, but I had a new notion. Just had to put together some money. I didn't know a legal way to do that quickly. My mind swung back and forth between practical and my newfound conscience until we had to make the first transfer stop. I waited at the little stand, a little impatiently. It was getting cold, and I was tired and hungry and frustrated. 2 other passengers had exited the bus with me, also tired-looking, typical specimens of the area, faces held down and unclear, shoulders drooped with world weariness, shabby but clean clothes. These were part of the majority in the area, financially poor, just wanting to go about their lives with no more misery and discomfort than absolutely necessary. The locale was tough because a high percentage of criminals operated in it than in other places. Easy to be a criminal when the local population can't afford to pay for politicians to order in more law enforcers. At least not the good ones, like the ones I'd met downtown. I was sunk in these gloomy thoughts and failed to notice that my 2 companions, who were not dressed warmly enough for the weather, had risen and begun to sidle in my direction. They were almost within arm's reach when their movements caught my stray attention. I casually put my hands on my waist in what I hoped would appear to be impatience for the next bus on my route to arrive. In fact, I wrapped one hand around the side of the claw knife and edged my thumb inside my pants to loosen the longer blade in its sheath. I didn't know whether these 2 were about to jump me for my wallet or whether they were part of some otherworldly plot. I whipped my weapons from their scabbards, strode forward 2 steps towards the edge of the roadway, and whirled to face my would-be attackers. One looked up astonished, his fingers frozen in motion around the cigarette he'd chosen to light. The corneas of his eyes showed in fear. The other scrambled to pull something out of his pocket. Stop! Leave it, whatever it is, I grated. The scrambler relaxed his shoulders and slowly removed his hands from the hoodie pocket that hung above his waistline. Just my paper spray, man. I can't afford to get jacked. Cigarette guy just continued to stare. as his unlit cancer stick dangled from his gaping mouth. I felt like an ass. They just stood because the bus was now rolling down the street in our direction. I walked between them towards the shadows behind the bus stop. As I passed them, I looked towards the man in the hoodie. I wasn't going to jack you. I thought you two were about to. At that point, Cigarette Guy punched me in the kidneys and shoved me towards the shadows and the hedgerow that cast them. Scrambler pulled out a ridiculously small handgun and tried to raise it. I used the big blade to sever his wrist, then continued the lowering arc and cut Cigarette Guy across the tops of his thighs and the front of his groin. I could hear them screeching as I dove through the hedge and into the barren lot between an old house and an old-style red brick building. I ran into the dark, the curses and whines of my would-be robbers chasing me into the gloom. I slowed as I reached the back end of the property. There was a fence ahead and another old structure on the next property. I'd have to scale the fence, then cut through the next block and hope I could stay ahead of any eyes. It wasn't likely that anyone would call the police, but I didn't want to take chances. There were shadows along the property, but old yellow lights penetrated and allowed me to see enough to keep from falling. I hit the fence at a run and looped my leg over the top. Fortunately, the spikes along the top were decorative rather than sharp. I landed on the other side in a crouch and turned, still low to the ground, to look behind me. So quote, "This raven." Oh, this is getting good. We are finding more about Coyote. I hope you enjoyed, everyone. Have a lovely day. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.